Okay, so let's dive right into this. We've got quite a collection of articles and some of your own thoughts on a topic that's really got people talking Christian nationalism here in the U.S. You're concerned about what it means for democracy, the separation of church and state,
Yeah.
and even the possibility of a theocratic government. We're going to try to unpack all these sources and see if we can shed some light on this whole movement, where it's coming from, and what it could mean for the future of America.
It is fascinating to see how this ideology is going from something that was kind of on the fringes to something that's becoming much more mainstream. And you highlighted Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's call for Republicans to embrace Christian nationalism
Yeah,
in that Time article. And,
yeah.
it really does raise questions about where do we draw the line between faith and governance?
For sure. That Time article is pretty direct.
Mhm.
It lays out the core assumptions of Christian nationalism in a way that's, I don't know, it's pretty eye-opening. It's not just about being a Christian who loves their country.
Right, it goes much deeper than that. It talks about how Christian nationalism seeks to kind of like restructure American civic life around a very specific interpretation of Christianity, one that's both conservative and, as the article points out, quite ethnocentric.
So are they basically saying that America should be run according to their very specific version of Christianity?
Exactly, and they're not afraid to say it. The article highlights three major threats that Christian nationalism poses to the U.S., and it's chilling stuff: undermining democratic principles,
Right.
perpetuating racial divisions, and even fueling political violence.
Okay, wait a minute. How can a belief system be inherently anti-democratic?
Well, think about it this way. Democracy relies on shared power, right? It relies on respect for different beliefs and accepting the outcome of elections. But the core of Christian nationalism is this belief that power should be concentrated in the hands of those who believe they're carrying out God's will.
Okay, I see what you're saying. The Time article even brings up January 6th, saying that some Christian nationalists see that day not as an attack on democracy, but as a righteous fight.
Precisely. And that's a dangerous way of thinking in any democracy. And it actually connects to another point you raised, which is this sense of grievance among white Christians that we see in several of these sources.
Yeah, like that Guardian piece, for instance. It talks about how many white Christians feel like their way of life is under attack, that their values are being threatened. And they cite some interesting data that shows Americans vastly overestimate the size of minority groups, which suggests a pretty skewed perception of reality.
It's interesting how this perception feeds into this narrative of white Christian victimhood and creates fertile ground for movements that promise to restore a sense of order and control.
Which brings us to a really interesting part of this whole deep dive, right? The new Apostolic Reformation. Both the Southern Poverty Law Center interview and that Atlantic article that you sent really delve into this movement, and it sounds, I don't know, pretty intense.
It is the new Apostolic Reformation, or NAR, is a movement within Christianity that has been growing for decades, and it plays a significant role in shaping the Christian nationalist agenda.
So what's the NAR all about?
At its heart, the idea is that Christians are meant to have dominion over every aspect of society. So it's about gaining cultural and political power to create a society that aligns with their interpretation of God's will.
And that's where that term Christian supremacy comes
Yeah.
in, right?
Exactly. It's not about coexisting or respecting different beliefs. It's about dominance.
Right. One figure who keeps coming up is C. Peter Wagner, right? He wrote that book, Dominion. He's kind of like their founding father, isn't he?
Yeah, you could say that. Wagner was a theologian and a missiologist who had a profound impact on the development of the NAR. And one of his key concepts was dominionism, this belief that Christians should rule over all areas of life, from government and education to the arts and media.
Okay, so we have dominionism. But the Atlantic article also mentions this thing called the Seven Mountain Mandate. What's that about?
The Seven Mountain Mandate, popularized by this NAR prophet, Lance Wallnau, takes this dominionism idea and makes it super specific. It identifies these seven spheres of influence in society, like these seven mountains, that they believe Christians need to take control of in order to transform the culture. So we have religion, family, education, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business.
So it's not just about being good Christians. It's about taking control of every major aspect of life.
Yes. And they encourage their followers to actually infiltrate these spheres, to rise to positions of power, and to shape them according to their beliefs.
Wow, that SPLC interview was I don't know, it was a little chilling when they talked about spiritual warfare. Like they were talking about demons controlling institutions, spiritual battles for territory. It's like something out of I don't know, a movie or something.
Yeah, it sounds very dramatic. But it's a concept that's absolutely core to the NAR worldview. They believe that there's this constant cosmic battle between good and evil going on, and it's playing out in both the spiritual and physical realms. So politics to them isn't just about policies or elections, it's a literal battle against demonic forces.
And that ties back into the idea that Trump was like God's chosen one, like a modern day Cyrus figure.
Exactly. And the Atlantic article gives this chilling example of this mindset with a prayer group in Pennsylvania after Trump's election, where they're talking about, the media being a demonic stronghold and the need for Christians to just, fight, fight, fight. It's this kind of language that can lead to a real us versus them mentality that makes compromise and understanding impossible.
But here's where it gets really interesting, right?
Yeah.
You also included this report from the Pew Research Center that talks about America becoming less Christian. They paint a picture of a future where Christians may not even be the majority.
That's right. The report highlights the rise of the knowns, the religiously unaffiliated, especially among younger generations. And that trend has huge implications for the future of American society, especially when you consider the goals of Christian nationalism.
Right. It's like we have these two forces at play here, right?
Yeah.
We have this movement pushing for Christian dominance and this demographic shift suggesting that Christianity is losing its grip.
Yes, and that makes it even more difficult to predict what the future holds. It's going to be fascinating to see how these trends actually play out and what impact they have on American culture and politics.
You know, one article that really got me thinking was that one from Dame Magazine. They asked this provocative question, right? Is religion actually good for America?
It's a question that often gets lost in the noise of political debates, and they make a compelling case for, examining the impact of religion without making assumptions. They point to studies that show atheists exhibit moral behavior, so they challenge the idea that religion inherently makes people better. They even critique the financial practices of some religious organizations, like the Mormon Church allegedly hoarding donations, or those prosperity gospel preachers enriching themselves while ignoring the poor.
And then there's this whole issue of religious organizations receiving public funds while discriminating against those who don't share their beliefs, right? Like they gave examples of homeless shelters turning away transgender people and adoption agencies refusing to place children with families of different faiths.
It's a very controversial area where the lines between religious freedom and discrimination can become very blurry, and it raises tough questions about how we balance individual rights and the role of religion in a pluralistic society.
It doesn't seem like there's an easy answer to the question of whether religion is, a net positive or negative for society.
It's a nuanced issue, but one thing's clear is that we can't make sweeping generalizations about people based solely on their religion.
One thing that really jumped out from that Politico article was just how much support there actually is for Christian nationalism. They found that a majority of Republicans would actually favor declaring the United States a Christian nation.
That's a striking finding, and what's even more remarkable is that a significant portion of those who support this declaration acknowledge that it would be unconstitutional.
Wow.
It really shows how deeply ingrained this ideology has become.
So they know it goes against the First Amendment, but they still want it anyway.
And the article points out that this support is particularly strong among white evangelical and born-again Christians who make up a large part of the Republican base.
Which makes sense considering, what we were talking about with an NAR and its influence. But the article also notes a generational divide, right? Younger Republicans are less likely to support declaring the U.S. a Christian nation than older generations.
That's an interesting trend and kind of aligns with the Pew Research Center's findings on religious affiliation among younger Americans. So, it makes you wonder if support for Christian nationalism might decline as these younger generations gain more influence.
That's true. But Politico also cautions that this strategy of appealing to Christian nationalism might work in the short term, but could alienate younger voters and actually hurt the Republican Party in the long run. It's interesting how these political strategies are playing out against this larger cultural shift around religion in America.
Absolutely. And speaking of cultural shifts, the Pew Report really digs into the factors driving people away from Christianity. And it's not just It's not just young people being rebellious. There are some serious social and cultural forces at play. Things like delayed adulthood, changing family structures, and even politics are all contributing to this shift.
That part about delayed adulthood was really interesting. They argue that as people delay settling down and having families, they're less likely to be drawn to the traditional structures of church life. And by the time they might consider joining a congregation, they've already established routines and social networks that don't involve organized religion.
It's a fascinating insight into how these larger societal changes can affect something as personal as religious affiliation. And, let's not forget the impact of politics, right? The report talks about how associating Christianity with conservative politics has turned off a lot of people, especially younger liberals and moderates.
It's a theme that comes up in a lot of these articles. The Christian right has become so intertwined with the Republican Party that it's hard for some to separate the two. And that Dame magazine article really hits on this, arguing that this fusion of religion and politics is actively harming America.
They make a powerful argument. By focusing so much on personal morality and aligning themselves with a specific political agenda, they've alienated a large segment of the population and actually contributed to the very polarization that they often criticize.
Well, we've covered a lot here. We've talked about the rise of Christian nationalism, the role of the NAR, and this changing religious landscape in the U.S. But I think we've barely scratched the surface of the historical roots of this movement. Where did this ideology come from, and how long has it been brewing in America?
That's a crucial piece of the puzzle, isn't it? Understanding the historical context is really essential to grasp the complexities of this movement. And it's important to remember that Christian nationalism isn't a new phenomenon. It's been kind of woven into the fabric of our nation from the very beginning, ebbing and flowing throughout our history.
So if we go back to the founding of America, was it actually intended to be a Christian nation, like some Christian nationalists claim?
That's a question historians have debated for a very long time, and the answer is complicated. While many of the founding fathers did identify as Christians, their beliefs varied widely. Some were quite devout, while others had more, Deist views. They believed in a creator God, but not necessarily the divinity of Jesus or the authority of the Bible. They weren't a homogenous group united under one specific interpretation of Christianity.
So it's not as simple as some might think.
Definitely not. And you have to remember that the context back in the 18th century was very different from today. Religion played a much more central role in public life back then. The concept of a secular government was still pretty new.
But didn't the founding fathers separate church and state in the Constitution?
Yes, they did. The First Amendment clearly states that the government can't establish a state religion and guarantees freedom of religion for everyone. And that principle, the separation of church and state, is really a cornerstone of American democracy.
Okay, so how do Christian nationalists reconcile their beliefs with that?
They argue that the separation of church and state has been misinterpreted. They claim that it was intended to prevent government interference in religious practice, not to exclude religion from the public square.
So they're saying the government should be able to promote and endorse Christianity?
Essentially, yes. They believe that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that it should be governed according to those principles.
But if we actually look back at history, isn't that a very selective interpretation? I mean, the founding fathers were trying to avoid the religious persecution that plagued Europe at the time.
You make a good point. Their goal was to create a system that protected religious freedom for everyone, not just for Christians. They understood the danger of mixing religion and politics.
So it seems like this tension between having a secular government and this desire to give Christianity a privileged position has always kind of existed in America.
Absolutely. It's been this constant back and forth between different groups, all vying for power and influence.
And it seems like that struggle has really intensified in recent decades.
Yes, the rise of the religious right in the late 20th century really brought this conflict to the forefront. Groups like the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition rallied conservative Christians around issues like abortion, school prayer, and gay rights. And they became a powerful force in Republican politics.
And that's when we started seeing more explicitly Christian nationalist rhetoric coming out, right?
Exactly. And it's continued to gain momentum, fueled by anxieties about social and political changes, shifting demographics, and this feeling of grievance among some white Christians who feel like they're losing their place in society.
It's interesting that this Southern Poverty Law Center interview mentions that the new Apostolic Reformation emerged in the 1980s, right around the same time the religious right was gaining political power.
That's a crucial connection. The NAR, with its focus on dominionism and spiritual warfare, provided this theological framework for the Christian right's political agenda.
So it wasn't just about opposing abortion or supporting school prayer. It was about reclaiming America for God and establishing a society ruled by, by Christian principles.
Precisely, and that's what makes this movement so concerning. It's not just about influencing policy. It's about fundamentally changing the nature of American democracy.
And the Atlantic article kind of digs into how the NAR has been spreading its message and building influence.
Right. They talk about these conferences and training courses, these online ministries, even schools where they teach people about spiritual warfare and prophetic weaponry and, how to achieve dominion over the seven mountains of society. It's like they've created their own universe with its own language and strategies.
And it's been remarkably effective.
It really has. And it's striking how this movement has transcended those traditional denominational boundaries. It's not just Baptists or Pentecostals. It's a mix of different Christian groups who are all united by this belief in Christian dominionism.
And then you add in Donald Trump and, his role in amplifying Christian nationalist rhetoric and emboldening these movements.
That's right. Trump's embrace of Christian nationalist themes and his alignment with figures like Lance Wallnau and Paula White gave this movement a level of mainstream acceptance it had never really had before.
So it's not just a fringe group anymore. It's a real force in American politics.
It is, and that's why it's so crucial to understand its history, its ideology, and its strategies. We can't afford to ignore it or underestimate its power.
Hearing all of this is pretty unsettling. It feels like this massive, complex force that's like deeply embedded in our culture and our politics.
I understand. These are complex and challenging issues to confront. It's normal to feel a lot of different emotions, but I think it's important to remember that awareness is always the first step towards understanding and action.
And that's why I appreciate these deep dives. They really help me make sense of the world and, equip me with the knowledge and insights to navigate these complex issues.
And that's what we're trying to do, right? To empower you to participate in these conversations and contribute to, a more informed and thoughtful public discourse.
So with all this information swirling around, what are the practical implications of this rise in Christian nationalism? Like, how do we even begin to counter this movement?
Those are great questions and ones we should definitely explore further. But first, maybe we should shift gears a little bit. You also sent this fascinating article about how the NAR has expanded its reach beyond just those inner circles and involves something you might not expect. The media. It's a point you brought up in your initial questions, and it's definitely worth examining. You were concerned about the possibility of a theocratic takeover, right? And the way this ideology is being spread through certain media outlets is something we should pay attention to.
Yeah, for sure. We talked about the NAR's network of conferences, those training programs, their online ministries.
Yeah.
But how much of that is actually reaching the average American?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. See, while the NAR might not be a household name, their ideas have been kind of quietly infiltrating mainstream media, especially in those conservative Christian circles. It's a much more subtle kind of influence.
So it's not just those niche conferences and online groups. They're aiming for a much broader audience.
Exactly. The Atlantic article highlights how these ideas have been strategically woven into the fabric of megachurches, radio programs, even TV shows with huge followings.
They mentioned that show Flashpoint, right?
Yeah, Flashpoint is a great example. It features some prominent NAR figures like Lance Wallnau and Gene Bailey, and it actively promotes their views on things like, spiritual warfare and dominionism, and this urgent call for Christians to take control of society.
And what's really scary is the size of their audience, right?
It's significant. The show is syndicated on a whole network of Christian radio and TV stations, and it reaches millions of viewers and listeners. It's a direct pipeline for these ideas into the homes of everyday Americans.
So we're not talking about some fringe group hiding in the shadows here. These ideas are being broadcast right into the mainstream.
That's right. And that's why, media literacy is so important these days. We need to be aware of the biases and agendas that might be shaping the information we're consuming. It's not always as transparent as it seems.
This whole thing feels kind of like a like a virus,
Hmm.
spreading through our culture, infecting people's minds with these dangerous ideas. It's pretty insidious.
It's a powerful analogy. It really highlights the need for critical thinking and, a healthy dose of skepticism, especially in this age of social media where misinformation spreads like wildfire.
So we've talked about the dangers of Christian nationalism, the role of the NAR, and this unsettling influence of media. But what about the average Christian in America? Are they all on board with this ideology?
That's an important question. And of course, the answer is no. Christianity in America is so diverse with a vast range of beliefs and practices. It's a mistake to paint them all with the same brush.
We can't just lump all Christians together and assume they all, support Christian nationalism.
No, absolutely not. There are many Christians who are deeply troubled by this movement, and they're actively working to counter its influence. They understand the dangers it poses to both their faith and, American democracy.
And the Pew Research Center report backs that up, right? They found that the Christian share of the U.S. population is actually shrinking, especially among younger generations.
Exactly. And while there are many factors involved, they do point to a backlash against the political activism of the Christian right as one of the key reasons for that shift. A lot of people, especially young Americans, are just disillusioned by this fusion of Christianity with conservative politics.
So it seems like there's a growing divide within Christianity itself, right? Between those who embrace this Christian nationalist ideology and those who reject it.
Yes. And that internal struggle it's a crucial part of the story. It's not just a battle between Christians and non-Christians. It's a battle for the future of Christianity itself.
It makes you wonder what's next for Christianity in America, right? If this trend of disaffiliation continues, will we see a decline in Christianity's influence on our culture and our politics?
It's a question only time can answer, really. But one thing that seems clear is that those traditional models of church and religious authority just aren't resonating with a lot of people anymore.
Maybe this is an opportunity for a new kind of Christianity to emerge, right? One that's more inclusive, more engaged with the world, and more focused on social justice than political power.
That's a hopeful vision, and I do think there are signs that this kind of transformation is already underway in some progressive Christian communities. It'll be interesting to see how those movements evolve and gain traction in the years to come.
One of the articles you sent, How America Lost Its Religion from the Atlantic, really goes into this shift away from organized religion. And they offer some really compelling reasons for why this is happening.
Yeah, it's a fascinating look at the social, cultural, and political factors that are contributing to the rise of the nudes.
They talk about how the Christian right's close alliance with the Republican Party has alienated a lot of people, especially younger liberals and moderates.
Hmm.
And I think it makes sense.
Right, it's kind of like an unintended consequence of their political activism. By becoming so closely tied to one political party, they've kind of pushed away people who just don't share those views.
And the article also points to how, individualism and consumerism in American culture have led people to seek spiritual fulfillment outside of those traditional religious institutions.
It's like people are creating their own personalized spirituality, picking and choosing from different traditions to build something that meets their individual needs.
So it's not necessarily a rejection of spirituality, but a search for, a more personalized approach.
Exactly. And we're seeing that trend in many areas of life, not just religion.
The article also mentioned the decline of trust in institutions, including religious ones.
Right. Those scandals within the Catholic Church, the financial problems among those televangelists, and the perception that, some churches prioritize political power over spiritual guidance. All of that has contributed to this erosion of trust. People are looking for authenticity and meaning, and they're not always finding it in those traditional institutions.
And then, of course, there are those demographic shifts we talked about earlier, right? With younger generations much less likely to identify with any religion.
Right. And the article suggests this is a trend that's likely to continue as these younger generations reshape, the cultural landscape. It's a demographic wave that could have a huge impact on the future of religion in America.
So the future of Christianity in America is, it's uncertain to say the least.
It really is. But one thing that does seem clear is that those traditional models of church and religious authority just aren't resonating with many people anymore.
One thing I keep thinking about through all of this is, what actually defines America? It feels like that's really at the heart of this whole thing.
That's a deep question and one that's been debated since, well, since the very beginning of our nation. It goes to the core of who we are as Americans.
On the one hand, we have this strong tradition of religious faith, especially Christianity, that's had a huge impact on our history and our culture.
Right. It's undeniable that Christianity has played a huge role in shaping American identity, from our morals and our social institutions to, even our political discourse.
But on the other hand, we also have this strong tradition of individual liberty, religious freedom, and the separation of church and state, which seems to be at odds with this whole idea of a Christian nation.
That's the paradox, isn't it? At the heart of the American experiment, we have this nation founded on both religious ideals and secular principles. And that tension has always been there. It's part of what makes us, unique.
And it seems like that tension is, I don't know, like it's reaching a boiling point with the rise of Christian nationalism.
You're right. This movement is really challenging the foundations of our democracy and forcing us to confront these fundamental questions about who we are and what we really stand for.
Because if America is truly a Christian nation, like Christian nationalists claim, what does that mean for those who don't share those beliefs?
That's the core of the problem, right?
Yeah.
If you give one religion a privileged position, it's going to undermine the rights and freedoms of everyone else.
And that goes against everything America is supposed to stand for.
It does. The very thing that has drawn people to America from all over the world is that promise of freedom, opportunity, and equality, no matter what their religion is, no matter their race, ethnicity, or background. That's what makes America exceptional, not the dominance of any one particular religion.
And Christian nationalism really threatens that promise.
It does. It wants to replace this ideal of a pluralistic society where diverse beliefs and values are respected with this homogenous Christian nation, where one religious group gets to dictate the rules for everyone.
And that's not just a threat to non-Christians, right?
Right.
It's a threat to anyone who values freedom of thought and conscience and belief.
Yeah.
It's an attack on the very idea of a free society.
Exactly. Because when you have one group that claims a monopoly on truth and righteousness, it always leads to intolerance, oppression, and the silencing of anyone who disagrees. History shows us what happens when religion becomes a tool of political power.
That's not the kind of America I want to live in. It feels like a betrayal of the very principles that make this country great.
I agree, and I think it's up to all of us, no matter what we believe, to resist this dangerous ideology and fight for a society that is more just, more inclusive, and more genuinely democratic.
So what does that look like in practice? How
Yeah.
can we, how can we as individuals actually counter this movement and protect the values that make America truly exceptional? What can we actually do?
Well, as we've discussed, I think it starts with education, right? We need to have those open and honest conversations up these issues. We need to help people understand the history of Christian nationalism, the dangers it poses,
Yeah.
and how it can, undermine those democratic values. Knowledge is power, and the more people understand the threat, the better equipped they'll be to resist it.
So we need to be aware of their rhetoric, their tactics, their goals, so we can recognize them when we see them and push back against them.
Exactly. And that means having those tough conversations even when they're uncomfortable, even when you might face resistance.
It takes courage, for sure, but it's essential to stand up for what we believe in. And what about political action? Is that part of the solution?
It's absolutely crucial. We need to support candidates and organizations that are committed to protecting democracy, religious freedom, and the rights of all Americans. It's about, putting our values into action.
So voting, donating, volunteering, advocating for policies that promote inclusion and equality, those are all things we can do, right?
Yeah.
It's about making our voices heard and holding our elected officials accountable.
Yes, and making sure that they represent the interests of all their constituents, not just those who share their religious beliefs.
The Politico article really stressed the importance of engaging younger generations in this fight. They found that younger Republicans are actually less supportive of Christian nationalism, and that Pew report shows that young people in general are much more likely to be religiously unaffiliated. They're the future of this country, and their perspective is so important.
Absolutely. Reaching out to younger generations and bringing them into these conversations is essential. They need to be heard, and their energy and their idealism can be such powerful forces for change.
Yeah.
Maybe by mobilizing young people and building a broader coalition of those who reject this this divisive ideology, maybe we can shift the tide and ensure that America remains a beacon of hope and freedom for everyone. It feels like we're at a real crossroads, and the choices we make now will have, lasting consequences.
It's a vision worth fighting for, and I believe we have the power to shape a better future.
Okay, so we've talked about education, advocacy, political engagement, but there's one more element I want to touch on: empathy.
Empathy. How does that fit into this conversation?
Well, I keep thinking about, how the sources describe that sense of grievance and victimhood that's fueling the rise of Christian nationalism.
Right. That Guardian article highlighted how many white Christians feel like their values and their way of life are under attack. They feel threatened, like they're losing their place in society.
Right. And it's easy to dismiss those feelings, to label them as, paranoia or bigotry. But I think it's important to try to understand where they're coming from, to see the world through their eyes, even if we disagree with their conclusions. It's about recognizing their humanity.
I think you're right. Empathy doesn't require us to condone or accept harmful beliefs. It's about understanding the underlying fears and anxieties and, motivations that drive them.
If we can understand where they're coming from, maybe we can find a way to bridge the divide, have a more productive dialogue, and, find some common ground.
It's a tough task, but it's essential if we want to build a society that's more unified and harmonious. Division thrives on misunderstanding, and empathy is that first step towards healing.
And maybe by, approaching these conversations with empathy and understanding, we can start to chip away at that fear and resentment that's fueling this divisive movement. Maybe we can remind people that we're all in this together, despite our differences.
That's a great goal. Ultimately, the antidote to division is connection, and the antidote to fear is understanding.
This deep dive has been quite a journey, exploring the rise of Christian nationalism, the dangers it poses, its historical roots, and all these complex forces that are shaping the future of religion in America.
It has been a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation, and honestly, you've done a fantastic job of synthesizing these complex ideas and presenting them so clearly and engagingly.
I have to admit, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by it all. It's a lot to take in, for sure, but I also feel, a sense of empowerment. Like I have a better understanding of what's at stake here and what I as an individual can do to make a difference.
That's the power of knowledge, isn't it? It can be unsettling to confront, challenging realities, but it can also be very liberating. It allows us to go beyond just passively observing things to actively engaging with the world around us.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a final thought, something to think about as they continue to explore this topic.
I'm listening.
Given what we've learned about the rise of Christian nationalism, this changing religious landscape, and the potential threats to democracy, what role do you think religion should play in American public life in the 21st century?
Wow, that's a big question, and one that I think every American really needs to grapple with. I think the answer will truly shape the future of our nation.
Yeah, it's a question with no easy answers.
Yeah.
It's one that really challenges us to think about, what religious freedom means, the role of government, and even the nature of the pluralistic society.
For sure. It's a conversation that needs nuance. It needs critical thinking. It needs people to be willing to, engage with different viewpoints. There are no simple solutions here.
I think at the end of the day, the goal should be to create a society where everyone feels respected and valued, regardless of their religious beliefs, or even if they don't have any.
I totally agree. It's about finding that balance, a way for a religion to coexist with those secular values and those democratic principles without one infringing on the other. It's tricky, but it's something we have to strive for.
This deep dive has been, it's been quite a journey. We've really gone deep into this whole idea of Christian nationalism and the dangers that come with it, its historical roots, and all those complex social and cultural forces that are shaping the future of religion in America.
It's been fascinating, hasn't it? And unsettling at times, but I think you've done a really good job of, weaving all these threads together and connecting those complex ideas in a way that's both clear and thought-provoking.
I got to admit, I'm feeling a little, overwhelmed by it all. It's definitely a lot to process, but I also feel kind of empowered. Like I have a better grasp of what's at stake and what I can actually do about it.
That's the thing about knowledge, isn't it? It can be a little scary to confront, to confront these challenging realities, but it can also be really liberating. It gives us the tools to move beyond just sitting back and watching to actually getting involved and, engaging with the world.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I want to come back to you, the listener. Remember at the beginning, you sent us a message along with all these articles and, expressed some real concern about the possibility of a theocratic takeover. Well, everything we've talked about today just underscores how important it is to stay vigilant, to understand these trends, and to be able to recognize those tactics when you see them.
Exactly. It's not enough to just be aware of these issues. We have to be actively involved in pushing back against these forces that are threatening the core of our democracy.
So what can our listener do? Where do they go from here?
Well, like we said, education is key. Talk to your friends and family about these issues. Share what you've learned from this deep dive. Knowledge is contagious, and the more people understand this threat, the stronger the resistance will be.
Don't underestimate the power of your own voice,
Mm.
right? Speak out against intolerance and discrimination whenever you see it. Support organizations that are, fighting for religious freedom and democratic values.
And voting is huge too. Really research those candidates and make choices that align with your values. Support those who are really championing that pluralistic society and standing up against religious extremism creeping into our government.
And remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So stay involved, stay informed, and never lose hope. The future of our nation depends on it.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey exploring Christian nationalism in America.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listener, we encourage you to continue your own exploration of this topic. Keep asking those tough questions, challenge those assumptions, and keep the conversation going, because the future of our democracy might just depend on it.